In this episode, I want to answer two questions. Is Jesus God? And did the miracles prove that Jesus is God? To the first question, I can give a fairly simple answer, yes. I'll give an explanation of why I say that shortly. To the second question, I give maybe a little less standard answer that no, I don't think the miracles prove that Jesus is God. But let's start with, I think, the more obvious one. Is Jesus God? To that, I would say emphatically yes. We've been going through the book of John in my podcast recently, and the Gospel of John starts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John uses the past tense there because he's talking in the beginning, but Jesus' status didn't change, so he still is God. Jesus also claimed to be God. My last podcast in John chapter 5, he said, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." And the Jewish leadership recognized his statement that he was claiming to be equal with God in that statement. So there Jesus claimed to be God. He also said things like, "I and the Father are one." He also, in multiple incidences, used the God's chosen name for himself. Jesus applied it to himself. A couple of podcasts ago, looking at the incident of the woman at the well, and at one point she said, "Well, when Messiah gets here, he'll explain all of this to me." And Jesus responded, I who speak to you am he. I think the word he is not actually there, but I who speak to you am. That's the word I am, with a few extra words thrown in there. And I am is God's chosen name for himself. There's lots of other places, particularly in John, but I think in some of the other Gospels, where Jesus said things like, "I am he." And again, the word he is not in the original. Jesus didn't say, "I am he." He simply said, "I am." And the translators added the word he to make it read a bit better in English. But there's one place where most translators don't add the he. In John chapter 8, Jesus was having a dialogue, discussion, argument with the Jewish leaders. And at one point, Jesus said that Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. And the Jewish leader said, "Now, wait a minute. You're not even 50 years old yet, and you've seen Abraham?" And for a time reference, Abraham lived roughly 2,000 years before Jesus did. So how can you claim that you've seen Abraham? And Jesus responded to that, "Before Abraham was born, I am." Again, taking that name that God chose for himself, applying it to himself. And again, the people of the day correctly recognized what he had just done. They picked up stones to throw at him, to stone him, because in their mind, Jesus had just committed the worst of blasphemies by taking God's name upon himself. It would be blasphemy, except for one thing. Jesus was in fact speaking the truth. He was and is God. So Jesus claimed to be God. John said that he was God. Other of the apostles said the same thing. And I take that as fact, take that as true. Jesus was and is God, the Son of God, part of the triune God. So again, to me, that's the easy question. The other question, do Jesus's miracles prove that he is God? And to that one, I give the answer no. And I hope that you bear with me to get all the way through the answer of why I give that answer no. And towards the end of the podcast, why I think that's important. So let's start with, what did some other people say about Jesus? And a few podcasts ago looked at chapter 3, where a man by the name of Nicodemus came to Jesus. And Nicodemus, when he met him, he started out, "Rabbi," John chapter 3, verse 2, "Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." So Nicodemus recognized that the signs, the miracles that Jesus had done, were evidence that God was with Jesus. Chapter we haven't looked at yet, John chapter 9. Jesus healed a man who was born blind and happened to do it on the Sabbath, and that caused a controversy. And so the man who was born blind was healed, was interacting with the Jewish leaders, and they were saying, how did you get your sight back? What happened here? And at one point, they said, John chapter 9, verse 17, they said therefore to the blind man again, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? And the man said, he is a prophet. And he was probably thinking of the prophets of old, Elisha and some of the others who did miracles like this. And so this person who did this miracle, that I've heard the Old Testament stories, he must be one of those guys. Well, a little bit later, as they continue to dialogue back and forth, dialogue is maybe a bit too courteous, argue back and forth. They eventually, ask him again, what did he do to you? And he related the story again. And in verse 28, it says, they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, you're Jesus' disciple, but we are disciples of Moses, and, claiming the high ground there. So we know that God has spoken to Moses, or probably ought to say, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't even know where he's from. To which the man who was born blind and got healed responds, well, now here is an amazing thing. That you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes? We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, God hears him. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And so this man who was born blind again recognized that the miracle of giving him sight, someone who was born without sight, is evidence that Jesus came from God, that God was with him, that God was giving him the power to do these things. So these are witnesses of people who had observed miracles, and including one who had had a miracle done to him. What does Jesus say about himself? In my previous podcast, looking at John chapter 5, and some of the key thoughts I want to talk about in this one also come from John chapter 5. So in part of John chapter 5, Jesus is talking about what's the evidence that I present for who I am. And he says, if I just give my own evidence, that's not good enough because you need a testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So he cites John the Baptist, who testified of Jesus, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He also said that he's greater than I am because he existed before me, even though Jesus was born about 3 months after John. So acknowledging his eternal nature, which implies that he's God. But Jesus said, chapter 5, verse 36, but the witness which I have is greater than that of John, for the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. Exactly the same witness that Nicodemus gave. Your works, your miracles, your signs prove that God's with you. And exactly the same testimony as the man born blind. Clearly this guy's from God, otherwise he could do nothing. Jesus makes the same claim about his miracles, that they don't prove that he is God, they prove that he is sent from God. So before I get into that distinction and why it's important, let's think for a minute about the Old Testament prophets. Some of the Old Testament prophets did miracles, including healings and other things. Many of the Old Testament prophets told about things before they happened. So, tomorrow or next week, or maybe even the distant future, such and such is going to happen. So why did God give the prophets of the Old Testament the ability to do those kinds of things or say those kinds of things? Before answering that question, again, a step back a minute. What was the primary role of a prophet? Why did God send prophets? We have his written word, so we can read about what God wants us to know about. In ancient times, they didn't have that benefit. Even as the Bible, as the Old Testament began to be compiled, most people didn't read. Books weren't generally available, or scrolls, as the case may be. And so they couldn't simply read about what God wanted them to know. And even if they could, the record wasn't complete yet. So when God wanted to speak to the people, he could have, voice from heaven, and he occasionally did that, but that was pretty rare. Most of the time, he used another person to speak to the people he wanted to speak to. So God would meet with a prophet and say, "This is my message that I want you to give to the people." And so the prophet could go to the people and say, "Thus saith the Lord," and I quote, blah, 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 here's the words of the Lord, end quote, because God told the prophet what to say. So they were the mouthpieces of God in a very literal sense. God came to them, said, "Here is my message, go deliver my message to the people." So they were speaking for God. So why the miracles? Why the foretelling the future, which is just another form of miracle? Well, it's fairly easy for anyone to say, "Thus saith the Lord." So how could the people tell which prophets I ought to pay attention to and which prophets are likely false prophets? And the miracles, the signs, and the foretelling the future identified these are the true prophets of God, so that when they say, "Thus saith the Lord," you ought to pay attention to them. In the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, God told Moses, because Moses was also a prophet, as part of the law, that the penalty for saying, "Thus saith the Lord," that such and such is going to happen, if it doesn't happen, the person who made the claim, "I'm speaking for God," was to be killed by stoning. That's how important it was. And so God gave miraculous signs, including foretelling the future, to identify these are truly my prophets, so that when they speak for me, you can trust that it is in fact my words that they're proclaiming. And so, fast forward to Jesus' life, Nicodemus said, "Clearly you're sent from God because of the signs that you've done. And so I want to hear truth from you, and I will believe what you say, because God gave evidence that you're from him." The man who was born blind said the same thing. "Clearly this man is from God, otherwise he couldn't have done this." And Jesus, most importantly, said the same thing about himself. "God gave me works to do to prove that he is the one who sent me." And so, as Jesus spoke prophetically, because speaking the words of God, when he said things like, "I and the Father are one," or when he said things like, "I am the I am," we can believe him and should believe him, because his life gave the evidence that God is the one who sent him. Therefore, his words are true. So why do I make such a big deal about the distinction of the miracles proving that Jesus is God versus the miracles simply giving the evidence that God is with him, that God sent him? And again, I want to answer that question, but let's look at one other thing first. Was there anything that Jesus did that a prophet could not do? Anything that Jesus did that clearly he had to be God in order to do that particular thing? Now, I'm going to leave out his death and resurrection, because a lot was going on there. When he died, it wasn't merely the death of his body. The Father poured his entire wrath that we deserved onto Jesus in his death. And so, having borne the sins of the world, for him to rise up again, those things, his death and resurrection, are truly unique. So I want to think about all of the other stuff that Jesus did. So Jesus did a lot of miracles. Um, were there miracles that Jesus did that no one else could do? To that, I would claim the answer is no. There weren't any miracles that Jesus did that no one else could do. So let's think about some of the miracles. Jesus did some healings, um, quite a bunch of healings. Old Testament prophets did healings. Elisha, there was a man, he was a commander of actually one of Israel's enemies, Naaman. He had leprosy, which was considered an uncurable disease, and Elisha healed him. In the New Testament, the apostles also did healings, and a great many healings. If you look at Acts chapter 5, I think it is, um, Acts chapter 5, verse 12, at the hands of the apostles, many signs and wonders were taking place among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. So many signs and wonders. But then it goes on in verse 14, and all the more believers in the Lord, multitude of men and women were continually added to their number to such an extent that they even carried the sick out into the streets and laid them on cots and pallets, so that when Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on any one of them. And also the people from the cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem were coming together, bringing people who were sick or afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all being healed. So the healings that Jesus did, Old Testament prophets, the apostles in the book of Acts did those. And again, a great many healings at the hands of the apostles. So the healings don't. What about raising from the dead? Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. There was a widow who lived in a village called Nain, and her only son died. Jesus saw the funeral procession and raised her son back to life and gave him back to his mother. So do raisings from the dead show that Jesus has a power that others do not? And again, Old Testament prophets raised from the dead. The apostles did in the book of Acts. In one of the Old Testament prophets, Elisha, he traveled around a lot, and there was one village that he passed through a few times called Shunem or something like that. And there was a lady who lived there and saw him go through. Hey, why don't you stay with us doing hospitality? And she recognized that he was a man of God. And so she convinced her husband, let's build a little apartment for him so that every time he passes through, he has a place to stay because he's a man of God. Maybe that'll bring a blessing to us. And so Elisha frequently stayed there with her, along with Elisha's servant Gehazi. And after he had done this a number of times, he said to her, you've shown me such hospitality over time. Is there anything that I can do for you? Do you want me to go to the king and speak a good word for you? And she said, no. I live among my own people. I'm happy here. I don't need wealth and fame like I get if you talk to the king about me. And so Gehazi, Elisha's servant, said, she doesn't have any children. She and her husband don't have any children, and her husband's getting old. And so Elisha said, a year from now, you're going to hold a son. You're going to have a child. And she, don't tease me that way. But sure enough, a year later, she had a son, which is a pretty remarkable thing that Elisha, foretold that. So she has the son, and when the son's still a young boy, he goes out to help his dad out in the field one day, and he starts to feel bad. He says, my head. And so the dad sends him back to the mom so the mom can take care of him. Says that she sat in the mom's lap until noon, and then the boy died. And then the woman has a donkey saddle. She gets on the donkey, heads off to find Elisha, and finds him and says, I didn't ask for a son. Why did you give me a son just to, cause me grief later on? And so Elisha makes haste, goes back to where the son was, and causes him to come back to life again and gives him back to his mom. So Elisha, in that incident, raised that boy from the dead. And clearly it was God's power that did that, not Elisha's power. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, there was a woman, I think her name was Lydia, and she died, and she was a believer and generous with her time and with her abilities, helping the saints out. And so Peter, I think it was, came and caused her to be raised from the dead, again, using God's power, clearly not his own. So people being raised from the dead was not limited to Jesus. Other people, both Old Testament and New Testament, did that as well. Well, there were times when Jesus knew what people were thinking, and people would say that as God, he was omniscient. And so, of course, he knew what people were thinking. He knew what was going on, even beyond human understanding, because he was God. He had that divine power of being omniscient, knowing everything. And yes, God knows everything, but again, it turns out that others had that same ability, not because they were divine, but because God gave them those insights. Again, in the life of Elisha, there was a time when one of the enemies, I think the king of Aram, if I remember the country right, he said, we're going to go and attack Israel, in this town right here. And so he sends his army out, but when the army gets there, the Israel army is there already because Elisha warned the king that this was going to happen. And so the enemy, well, we got unlucky. Let's try over here. And so they tried over there, and the same thing happened. Well, let's try over here. And again, the same thing happened. And so finally the king said, okay, who's the spy? Clearly one of you's a spy, because every time we make plans, the Israelite army is there to defend the part that we're trying to attack. And one of the advisors says, no, my king, it's the man of God, it's Elisha, that the God of Israel tells Elisha what you whisper even in your bedroom, and that's how they're finding out. And so that ability to know what was going on, what was people were thinking, even from a remote distance, God gave Elisha that ability because God was telling him those things. Mentioned the Shunammite woman and her son died. When she got to Elisha after she rode her donkey there, it says that she got off her donkey, grabbed onto his feet, and Elisha's servant Gehazi tried to shoo her away, but Elisha said, no, her heart is deeply troubled, but the Lord has hidden it from me. So God so often showed Elisha, told him somehow in his mind what was going on, what people were thinking, that in this instance, he thought it unusual that he didn't know what was troubling the woman because God had hidden it from him. So even that knowing what people were thinking, that doesn't prove that Jesus was God. And again, emphatically, he is God. He was God. But the things that he did not prove that. So again, why am I making such a big deal out of this? Why does it really matter? We are to be like Jesus. Even the word Christian, I think of the word Christian as saying Christ-like one. And so we're to be like Jesus. The book of Ephesians says that we're to grow up in all aspects into him. The book of Romans, Paul said that we were predestined to be conformed to his image, to be just like him. If Jesus walked here on earth, making use of his divine attributes, his divine power, then we could rightly say, I can't possibly be like Jesus because I'm not God. And he lived his life using his divine attributes. And so how could I be like him? Can't do that. That wouldn't quite be the whole truth because God says that he puts his life inside of us, but we'll ignore that. The argument would still hold. So what did Jesus say about himself when he was here on earth? Because if he didn't live making use of his divine attributes, his divine power, then that excuse that, well, I'm not God, so I can't do that, that excuse goes away. And for that, I wanted to look at some of the verses that I've commented on in my previous podcast from John chapter 5, verse 19. Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. So Jesus is saying, I don't do anything except what I see my Father doing. A little bit later, verse 30 in John chapter 5, I can do nothing on my own initiative. And he talks about judgment. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. In these verses and elsewhere, particularly in the Gospel of John, but also elsewhere, Jesus is making the statement, and I think a clear statement, that he was not living using his divine attributes. Instead, he walked here on earth in complete dependence on his Father. Why is that important? And again, if he made use of his divine attributes, we could rightly say it's unrealistic to expect me to live the way Jesus did. But if instead he walked not using his divine attributes, but instead in complete dependence on his Father, then he could say, I'm not asking you to do anything that I didn't do myself. And I think that's the point. That's why it's important to understand that none of the things that Jesus did here on earth, again, accepting his death and resurrection, none of the things that he did here on earth were, in a sense, unique to God. And so those things alone don't prove that he's God, simply that God sent him. Was he God? Absolutely. He said he was God, and the fact that it was clear that God sent him, we should trust his word. Yes, he is God. But his life here on earth was lived in dependence on his Father, not simply doing his own thing, making use of his own powers to do the things that he did. So again, why is this important? And I want to turn to John 15 and look at a couple of verses there. John 15 is the chapter where Jesus talks about, I am the vine and you are the branches. And in John 15, verse 4, he said, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. And so he's the vine, we're the branches. The command is to abide in him. And if you take a grapevine and you cut the branch off and, toss it on the ground, it's not going to bear fruit. It's going to shrivel up and die. But if the branch remains attached to the vine, then it will in fact bear fruit. Verse 5, I am the vine and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit, for apart from me, you can do nothing. Verse 8, by this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Just as the Father has loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. So what do we need to do to bear much fruit? We don't need to work really hard. We don't need to get, an advanced biblical education degree. We don't need to, be good at the spiritual disciplines. And not that any of those things are necessarily bad, but what does Jesus say? Abide in him. Trust in him, walk in complete dependence on him in just the way that he walked in complete dependence on his Father. And if we do that, what will happen? We will bear much fruit simply by abiding in him. And as we bear much fruit, Jesus said that the Father himself will be glorified. Why? Because the world will see that God is transforming us and God is moving through us to do his great and mighty works here on earth, showing his love, showing his compassion, showing his character as he forms his character in us. People will recognize that and see that it's God who's at work in us, and they will then glorify God as we live the same way Jesus did, by abiding in him in just the same way that he abode, whatever the past tense there is, in his Father. As we do the same thing and abide in him, Again, we saw the verse that the greater works than these will you do because I go to the Father. Jesus said that in John 14, I think it was. And so as he moves in us, as we depend on him, as we walk in dependence on him, God will in fact be glorified, because it's his great works that'll be manifested through us. So may he be glorified in your life as you walk in dependence on him, just the same way that Jesus walked in dependence on his Father.